Welcome back to Hoffman Tactical. In today's video, I'm going to be introducing you to the Super Safety. The Super Safety is a project I've been working on since early last year, and it's been in the works for a really long time. In this video, I want to go over what it is, what it does, all the details on it, and where you can get one yourself. So let's do it. The Super Safety is an active trigger system. It is a push-button safety that replaces the standard rotary safety on a normal AR-15. And when it does that, it acts as a safety. When you push it all the way over to the left-hand side, it acts as a cross-bolt safety, as a push-button safety. The gun is on safe. You can't pull the trigger, as you would expect. You push it all the way over to the right-hand side, and you're on fire. You pull the trigger, the gun shoots, as you would expect, just like a normal AR-15. And then you push it to the middle position, and the gun actually fires just like a normal AR-15. You pull the trigger once, the weapon fires, you release the trigger, you pull it again, the weapon fires. Semi-automatic like normal AR-15. The difference is the Super Safety rotates under some internal geometry that we'll talk about a little bit later, but the end result is that your trigger is actively reset into the ready position so that you can then pull the trigger again quickly and efficiently. And that allows you to fire very fast, very efficiently, and yeah, it's a ton of fun. So in this video, we are going to be showing you exactly how it works, kind of where you can find the parts. You can make it yourself because it is fully 3D printable. But first, we're gonna hit the range and actually shoot it a little bit and kind of give you a demo with a few different guns. And actually, we're already at the range, so I can just do that right now. So let's do it. So I have two USPCA targets right back here, and I'm going to be shooting at them. Right here I have, it's a printed lower. It's actually an experimental version 3.1 lower with a printed rubber band, but that doesn't matter here. We have a printed lower with an Aero Precision upper and a Super Safety in there. So I am going to do some single shots, and then we are going to go ahead and actually do some center of mass shots just to show you can still get hits when shooting fast with a Super Safety. So I think I got those hits on there. We'll see when we walk down there, but let's just flip to the middle position. Let's put it onto the safe position and walk down and see what that looks like. Yeah, we got the two headshots, and then here on the center of mass, we have two here, one there in the D zone, and we've got 5 in the center of mass there. And I was just pointing and clicking. I mean, I'm sure there's rounds missing here, but like right here, 4 in the A zone, 2 in the C zone, and then we got 2 in the D zone here. Oh, 3 in the D zone, 1 up there. So, I mean, most of these rounds are going on paper. All right, so one thing to keep in mind with the Super Safety is that it is actually a push-button safety. So I find push-button safeties to not be like any better than a standard safety that you rotate, but I mean, they do work fine. It's easy just to press it off and then just flip it back and forth. It's, I think, pretty straightforward. It is interesting to note that this is the version 3.1 lower that I modified to work with the Super Safety. The normal version 3.1 Super Lower, this hole is enclosed in, so you have to drill it out to make it work. The new version, which I'm working on right now, fixes that problem. A couple more single shots. I have the shot timer, so we're going to see how it does. All right, so that was the shot timer, just normal, whatever splits, 0.72 splits, which is, you know, just hand shooting at a distance. Okay, now we're gonna try the Super Safety with the shot timer and see how it does. We're gonna flip to the middle position there. So the Super, it's giving us splits are looking like 0.18, 0.7, 0.1. Let's try it one more time. That was 8 rounds. So 0.8, 0.1, 0.16, 0.1, 0.15, 0.17, 0.1. It's giving me splits of about 0.1 to 0.2, which seems not accurate. It should be more consistent. That I'm shooting pretty consistently. Okay, so I now actually just took my printed lower off and put a Palmetto State Armory PA-15 aluminum lower on here, which is actually just kind of my reference lower. It's the only one I actually have. And I'm going to be shooting this real quick just to demonstrate that the Super Safety does in fact work with any AR-15, and it's not just specific to my printed lowers. It's a pretty universal design, and yeah, let's run some rounds through this. Now for the serious part about exactly how the super safety functions. The super safety has a few different components inside of it that you wouldn't find in a normal AR-15. The most conspicuous component is the super safety itself, which we've been discussing. It's the part you can see on the outside of the firearm that you can push back and forth. It's the actual push button safety. That is the part I call the cam. Now there's another equally important component to making sure the super safety actually functions, and that is a component I call the lever. It's a lever which leads from the cam up to the bolt carrier group, and that lever on the bottom side has a dovetail on it, and this dovetail fits into a dovetail slot on the cam. Its job is to transfer force from the bolt carrier group to the cam, and the cam's job is to transfer force from the cam to the trigger. That kind of gives you a picture of the order that the force is moving in to get from the bolt carrier group to the trigger. Now you might not understand why we need to do this yet, but I'll talk about that in a second. There are a couple other components which are slightly modified from a normal AR-15 that I should briefly mention. One of those is the selector detent. It's a little detent that goes up underneath the selector switch for normal AR-15. It normally has a cone-shaped tip on it. On a push-button safety, like the super safety, the end of that detent needs to be rounded off so it can run smoothly over the detent track, which is actually a two-dimensional detent track on the super safety. It has to be able to rotate and slide from the 3 different positions back and forth. That pin has to be modified from a cone-shaped down to a round, smooth head to it. So that's one component which is relatively minor modification, but that has to be different. The other component, which is a little more major, is the trigger. The tail of the trigger, which normally interacts with your safety, is normally just a casting, and it has a pretty rough profile to it. And all it normally has to do is when you pull the trigger and the safety is on, it just prevents the trigger from lifting up by holding the back end of the trigger down. The way the super safety transfers force to the trigger is it has a cam on it. So you can think of the super safety as being an active safety. So rather than being a manual safety, which you have to turn on, which it still is, but when it's in the active reset mode in the middle position, it's basically turning the safety on every single time the weapon cycles. The bottom of the cam has that cam profile on it, and that cam profile has to interact with the tail of the trigger. In order to do that smoothly, we have to smooth down the tail of the trigger, and that can be pretty easily done with just some sandpaper and polishing paper. It's not super precision, it can be hand fitted. That has to be done. The trigger is still a standard mil-spec trigger, it just has to have a little polishing so it interacts with that curved surface on the cam. I should briefly mention here that there are 2 different options for cams in my design. One of those is only a 2-position cam, and that basically has safe and then active reset. You flip it over and it's active reset only. There isn't an option for a standard spring reset. The purpose of that is that modifying the trigger is a lot easier. You just have to simply polish it down and you're good to go. It also has a lot more bearing surface between the trigger and the cam, so that a 3D printed nylon cam just printed in plastic will actually last a pretty long time, a few hundred rounds. However, the selectable version with a 3rd position, which is of course the interesting one that I prefer, it has to have a much narrower bearing surface just because of geometry. So in order to modify the trigger for that, you have to make the trigger polished like you would for the 2-position cam, and then you have to use a Dremel tool and you have to grind down the tail so that only the left 80 thousandths or so of the trigger is intact. You're going to cut the rest of the trigger away. And at that point, your trigger is now complete and ready to work with the 3-position super safety. That sums up the modifications to the firearm and the parts that you need. Now let's go over exactly how it works. So the order of operation is the sequence of events that take place in order for the firearm to fire and do all the things it needs to get back to the next point where you can fire again. So the very first state in the order of operation is the initial state, which is when the hammer is cocked to the rear, the trigger is in its forward position, ready to be pulled in the reset position, and the bolt carrier group is forward, and the bolt is locked with a round in the chamber. So the gun is ready to fire. Everything starts when you pull the trigger. Now, when you pull the trigger, what happens is the hammer falls, it releases the hammer hits the firing pin, and the round is fired, your bullet goes down range. The next thing to happen is the gas system starts moving the bolt carrier to the rear. It starts hitting the hammer and moving the hammer to the rear. The hammer then catches on the disconnector, just as it does on any AR-15. The disconnector and the trigger and the hammer are exactly the same, actually. And that holds the hammer and keeps the hammer from going back forward again. As the bolt carrier group continues to move to the rear, it then hits the lever. And if you remember earlier, I said the lever's job is to transfer force from the bolt carrier to the cam. That's exactly what happens. The bolt carrier hits the lever and begins swinging the lever to the rear, and in turn rotating the cam. When the cam rotates, it actively moves the trigger back into the reset position because it has a cam surface, and as it rotates, it just basically turns the safety on. The bolt carrier moves all the way to the rear and then starts moving back forward again. As the bolt carrier moves back forward, the cam stays in the safe position and is exactly like having a safety turned on. Your bolt carrier group is now moving back forward. And at some point when the bolt carrier group is getting close to being in battery, back to being ready to fire again, it's stripping around off the magazine, the rear surface of the bolt carrier group hits the lever. And there is a good bit of delay in here between the rearward movement and the forward movement, because there's a big gap in the bolt carrier group between the part that cams the trigger down and the rear part that hits the lever towards this part of the operation. That causes the lever to rotate back forward, which in turn rotates the cam back forward, which allows the trigger to be pulled again. Things start over again, you pull the trigger, the gun fires, bolt carrier group moves to the rear, the trigger is actively moved to the reset position, bolt carrier moves back forward, the cam rotates to turn the safety off and allows you to fire again. So the last technical part here I want to talk about is how the 3-position super safety works. And also this also applies to 2-position, how it turns from safe to the fire position. The way that works is we have a few different detent tracks, which we mentioned earlier, that work with that rounded detent pin. So you can snap the super safety back and forth between the left side, the right side, and the middle side in the case of the 3-position super safety. The way it works is the super safety has multiple cam surfaces that engage with the trigger. The reason we have to cut most of the trigger away on the 3-position super safety is just because there isn't enough room to squeeze in cams that will engage with a full width trigger. In the safe position, the cam has a large diameter that no matter where the super safety is rotated to, it never allows the trigger to be pulled. In the fire position, when you push it all the way over to the right side, the cam is a very small diameter and it never really interacts with the trigger. So no matter where the cam is rotated to, it never interacts with the trigger, and it's just a passive spring reset like in any other AR. But when you flip it to the middle position, that's where the active super safety cam engages, and it operates like I just described, and that cam has the proper curved surface, and it basically has a low area and a high area, so you can pull the trigger and then it will rotate and turn the safety on. So that is how the selectable part works. It's actually super simple, just 3 different cams stacked on top of each other. The 2-position super safety is exactly the same, except there is only an active cam that resets the trigger and then the safety cam. And they're much wider so that they can interact with a standard trigger without having to cut half of it away. The trigger obviously still has to be polished, but that's about it. So that kind of sums up how the super safety works. If you really want to understand better, in the documentation of the super safety, which I'll tell you how to find in just a minute, I have a very detailed write-up, and it goes step by step over every little detail of what happens with very detailed drawings, and everything is carefully marked. So if you really want to have an in-depth understanding of the super safety and how it functions, I advise you to read that. But this video should give you an overview of how it works. A comment I know a lot of you guys are leaving down below, and I'm probably going to be reading them right now as you're watching this video, is the super safety a machine gun, and how is it even legal? Now, I'm going to preface this by saying I am not a lawyer. Do not take this as legal advice, and if you are going to make a super safety, I highly advise you to do your research, talk to a lawyer, and maybe talk to some experts on the subject to try to get your own understanding and not just rely on mine. Under federal law, a machine gun is defined as, and I will paraphrase here, a device which can shoot, is designed to shoot, or can be readily restored to shoot more than one shot without manual reloading by a single function of the trigger. And the key here is that last part, single function of the trigger. When Congress wrote this law, they were very, very specific about this. And it should be obvious because the way a normal semi-automatic firearm functions, including one with a super safety installed, is you pull the trigger, a round is fired, that's function number 1, and then the trigger is reset back to the ready position, that's function number 2, and then the cycle repeats, you pull the trigger, it fires a round, the trigger is reset, 2 functions, and so on and so forth until you run out of ammunition, you do a manual reload, though that's not really relevant to the law. So that is how a semi-automatic firearms works. That's exactly how the super safety works. You pull the trigger, the weapon fires, the trigger is reset, and then if you choose to do so, you can then pull the trigger again. The difference is it just allows you to do it a bit faster. You can fire a trigger, which is not a super safety. If you get like a Geisel or a nice lightweight trigger, you can fire it extremely quickly as well. And if you get someone like Jerry Michalak, he can fire as fast as a super safety. The speed at which the firearm fires is not what makes it a machine gun. What makes it a machine gun is there's specific mechanics involved, and you can understand why Congress defined it that way, because if they said a gun which fires faster than so many rounds per second or whatever is a machine gun, then that would make certain guns a machine gun when they're being shot by certain people. If Jerry Michalak is shooting your AR-15, it's suddenly a machine gun because it's shooting really fast. So you can clearly see why that wouldn't work. Under federal law, a machine gun is very specifically defined, and a super safety is simply not a machine gun. So at this point, you're probably wondering where you can find a super safety. So the super safety currently is actually not just an off-the-shelf item you can get. It's a 3D printable project, and all of the design goodness for it has been released. We'll talk about where to actually get that exactly next. But right now I want to talk about how it's made. So the super safety is currently made using additive manufacturing. So 3D printing it on a small, like 1/4 millimeter nozzle, using a wear-resistant nylon like the Polymaker PA12 carbon fiber nylon. That is currently the best way to make it at home. You might notice in some of these videos that I have a metal super safety cam, and it's a shiny, nice metal cam. That's actually because I've had a number of them 3D printed in 17-4 stainless steel. And the reason for that is the selectable 3-position active passive super safeties have a really narrow active cam, and it wears out really quickly when it's 3D printed in nylon. Even though the nylon is super wear resistant and you polish and make the trigger really smooth so as not to wear it down, it still wears out really quickly. So if you're interested in making a super safety, you want to start with probably just the 2-position super safety that does not have the active and passive modes, because it'll at least last a few hundred rounds, a couple hundred rounds, if properly printed in a good nylon. However, the 3-position super safety unfortunately really needs to be made in metal. A metal version is something which needs to be in the market. So stay tuned for that and keep an eye out for any potential releases for an actual kit or something along those lines with a metal version. Now let's talk about where you can find it. The super safety, if you're not familiar with my other releases, I've designed AR lowers, the Orca, which is a complete AR, which we've seen in this video here. I design and release files for free, so you can find the digital goodness for the super safety out on the Odyssey. My recommendation is simply to Google the channel name. Google is actually your friend here. I am being a little facetious, but really, Google is actually really good for this kind of thing. Just Google Hoffman Tactical. Spend a little bit of time just poking around my website, and you will very quickly find what you need to get the super safety. I can't leave any links here, unfortunately, because YouTube doesn't like them, but it won't be hard to find. Google is your friend. Go ahead and do it. Get that digital goodness and print yourself a super safety. I hope you enjoyed today's video. Hope you found it interesting, and hope you enjoyed the super safety. Thank you so much for watching. I will catch you again next time.